We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Justice, Pamela Bondi of Florida to be Attorney General.
President Pro Tempore.
First, a very short unanimous consent request for detailees to be on the floor with me. I ask unanimous consent that Sam Rui and Ivy Benchek, two detailees in my office, be granted 4 privileges for the remainder of Congress.
Without objection.
I come to the floor to speak about the nominee for Secretary of Veterans Affairs that we'll be voting on in a couple hours. I have long considered myself a friend of veterans, the men and women who have put themselves in harm's way to serve our country. They deserve our full support, and they have mine. Too often, I hear from veterans in Iowa that the Department of Veterans Affairs makes it difficult for them to access health care and the services that we honor them with because they have defended our country. Whether this is expecting them to drive an unnecessary distance for their initial disability exam or making it more difficult to seek the care that they choose outside of the VA system, our veterans deserved much better. The VA needs to do better. Which brings me to former Representative Doug Collins, President Trump's nominee to be Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Representative Collins, a veteran himself, recognizes the challenges veterans face with the VA. During his time in the House of Representatives, he was a supporter of giving veterans the choice on where to seek health care. He and I agree that the VA needs to do better by our veterans and taxpayers alike. This became more obvious to the public last year when the VA misled Congress by claiming the department was going to face a shortfall in funding, but in fact ended the fiscal year with a surplus, can you believe this, in the billions. When I heard about this alleged shortfall, I joined my colleagues, led by the junior senator from Alaska, to work to bring more transparency to the VA budget process. As I shared with Representative Collins, I will continue to do so. When we first met in my office, I gave Representative Collins my advice that I give to every nominee coming to the office, because these people come before the committee and one of the questions they're asked, will you answer our letters? And they all say yes, but we know as a matter of fact that doesn't happen as often as it should. So I suggested to him that maybe instead of saying yes, he say maybe, so he wouldn't turn out to be a liar ever. Unlike the former Secretary of VA, who did not feel the need to respond to even a bipartisan letter that I sent in October of 2024 alongside 3 of my colleagues before that secretary departed from his post. Now, Representative Collins understands the importance of being accountable and forthcoming to Congress because he has been a member of Congress. So I thank Representative Collins for his service to our country, and I look forward to voting positively on his nomination. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. Aye.
Ability to administer federal resources, censoring your free speech, locking you out of your workplaces, demonizing you in the press, and sending you ominous and at times threatening messages. These actions are shameful and harmful not only to you, but to the Americans across the country that you serve. But especially in the darkest of times, we must stay focused on finding our guiding lights. I hope you will let the call of service that you answered when you first swore your oaths as federal employees to serve as that light. My advice to you today is simple, even if it's not easy. Don't give up. Don't give up. Keep serving everyday folks. You are here because of your expertise, You are here because of your patriotism. You are here because you know the value in dedicating your life to serving your fellow Americans. America needs you, and that has never been clearer than in the wake of the administration's federal funding freeze last week. I heard from folks in every corner of Virginia about the invaluable support they receive from federal workers just like you. Across the country, Americans are counting on you to deliver crucial services, from inspecting our food to make sure it's safe, to protecting our national security, from administering Social Security benefits to staffing air traffic control towers, to supporting our allies around the world and keeping the influence of China, Iran, and Russia at bay. I know it has been and will continue to be tough. Donald Trump and cronies are determined to do anything they can to knock you off course. They've even dangled a phony buyout in your face. But make no mistake, that buyout is a trap. Donald Trump has no authority to offer you a resignation buyout. Don't trust a guy with a long history of stiffing contractors by taking him up on a sham deal that he won't follow through on. You aren't alone. I'm going to be here with you every day working alongside you in service. I want to share with you some specific ways in which I want to be a resource to you. On my website, kane.senate.gov, I am collecting stories from federal workers about what you are experiencing. Under no circumstances will I publicly share any information you send me without your consent. You can also choose to submit your information anonymously if you prefer. I will be updating my webpage with information that may be helpful to you, including summaries of your rights, recourse you can seek if you believe you are being illegally terminated, and answers to other frequently asked questions my office is receiving. Please know that I'm doing everything I can to stand up for you, just like you're standing up for and serving American people. Thanks for all that you do. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
to make sure that our Department of Justice is fighting on behalf of the American people and not an attempt, ironically, to undermine our republic, the very accusation that was leveled at Joe Biden's political opponent. And with that, Mr. President, I look forward to voting yes on Pam Bondi and having a real leader, somebody that we can look up to, lead that very important Department of Justice. I yield back.
And this should tell you exactly where we are going as a nation. These three men, wealthiest three in America, have become some $232 billion richer since Trump was elected a few weeks ago. Three guys, $232 billion richer since Trump was elected. Mr. President, this is how an oligarchic system works. Elon Musk, the wealthiest person in the world and now a key part of the Trump administration, spent over $277 million to get Trump elected. In other words, within a corrupt campaign finance system, which allows billionaires to spend as much as they want, he helped buy the election for Mr. Trump. Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, the second and third wealthiest people in our country, both kicked $1 million each into Trump's inauguration fund. And let us remember that Mr. Bezos, who among other things owns the Washington Post, rescinded the endorsement of that paper for Kamala Harris just before the election. Mr. Bezos was showing early on that he was willing to bend the knee for Donald Trump. Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO of Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, agreed to settle a lawsuit with Trump for $25 million. These three multi-billionaires are working with Trump for one very simple reason. They understand that Trump's policies are designed to make the very wealthiest people in this country even richer. Since Trump's election, Mr. Musk has become $154 billion richer. Not bad in a couple of weeks' time. He earned a great investment. He only spent a couple of $100 million on the election, and now he's $154 billion richer. Mr. Bezos has become $35 billion richer, and Mr. Zuckerberg has become $43 billion richer. Mr. President, I am concerned not only about the growing movement toward oligarchy in this country, but I am deeply worried that under the leadership of President Trump, we are moving rapidly towards authoritarianism. And all over this country, people are alarmed and shocked by what they have seen in the last several weeks. Just a few examples, just a few. Last week, President Trump attempted to suspend all federal grants and loans in direct violation of the U.S. Constitution and federal law. As every third grader in America knows, or I hope knows, the power of the purse in the United States belongs to Congress, not the president. Yes, the president can recommend legislation to Congress. The president can veto legislation that Congress has passed. But he does not have the power to unilaterally terminate funding and legislation that has been passed by the U.S. Congress. That is a dangerous and blatantly unconstitutional act. And I should add that Trump's blocking of federal funding would have had a horrific impact on millions of Americans who utilize programs like Medicaid, Head Start, community health centers, Meals on Wheels, homeless veterans programs, and many, many other initiatives. Tens of millions of Americans, including some of the most vulnerable in our country, were impacted by that decision. But that's not all. A few days ago, Trump fired 17 inspectors general, independent government watchdogs that were created by Congress in the wake of the Watergate scandal to prevent the abuse of power by the executive branch. Last week, President Trump fired a member of the National Labor Relations Board, and in so doing, effectively neutered the only federal agency in America with the authority to hold corporations accountable for illegal union busting and to protect the constitutional right of millions of workers who want to join unions in order to earn better wages, working conditions, and benefits. Not only is that move blatantly illegal, it is exactly what Elon Musk, the owner of Tesla, and Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, have been fighting for months. They don't like unions, and what Mr. Trump has given them is the opportunity to make it much, much harder for workers to organize in their companies. President Trump also illegally fired members of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the only independent commission in our country that protects workers against discrimination in the workforce. Further, and what should upset every American, no matter whether you're conservative, moderate, progressive, is that in direct violation of the Constitution and federal law, Trump is intimidating the media with lawsuits against ABC, CBS, Meta, and the Des Moines Register. his FCC is now threatening to investigate PBS and NPR. What Trump is essentially saying to every media outlet in America, if you say or do anything that is critical of me, that displeases me, you may be subject to a lawsuit or a federal investigation. If that is not a direct attack on the First Amendment, on the U.S. Constitution and free speech in our country, I don't know what is. But that is not all. Elon Musk and his unelected minions at Doge have forced out officials at the Treasury Department and illegally shut down USAID, a program which, among other things, helps feed and provide medical help to starving and desperate children all over the world. Presidents, much less unelected billionaires, do not have the unilateral right to shut down federal agencies established by Congress. When we talk about the very dangerous movement towards authoritarianism that we are seeing in this country now, let us not forget Trump's pardoning of the January 6th insurrectionists who injured 174 police officers right here, right outside this floor. Even worse, not only did he pardon those people, but Trump is undermining the FBI by actually investigating the agents there who helped bring these violent criminals to justice. Imagine that. Pardoning the people who broke the law and investigating the people who upheld the law. That is not what America is supposed to be about. And Mr. President, under Trump, we are rapidly moving toward a kleptocracy as well. Just before the president was inaugurated, he and his wife launched their own cryptocurrency coins, giving them the potential to earn many billions of dollars. If Wall Street CEOs tried to bribe the president with a bag full of money, that would be illegal. That's against the law. But now they don't have to do that. Today, if a multi-billionaire, the head of a foreign country, wants to curry favor with the president, all they have to do is buy his cryptocurrency coins, and when they do that, they are directly enriching Mr. Trump. So, Mr. President, the question that millions of Americans are asking is, given the move toward oligarchy, given the move toward authoritarianism, given the movement toward kleptocracy, where do we go from here? What should we as Americans be doing? And let me tell you what I think and what most Americans think. And that is, instead of moving toward an economy which is designed to benefit the very richest people in our country, we have got to create an economy and a government that works for all of us, not just for Mr. Musk or Mr. Bezos or Mr. Zuckerberg. Mr. President, at a time of massive wealth and income inequality, we have never had more income and wealth inequality than we have had right now. It is beyond stupidity to provide more tax breaks to the very richest people in our country and then to pay for those tax breaks by cutting back on Medicaid and other programs desperately needed by working families all across this country. That is what we should not be doing. But let me take a moment to tell you what we should be doing. At a time when 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured in our broken healthcare system, we have got to do what every other major country on earth does, and that is guarantee health care to all people as a human right, not a privilege. That's what we've got to do. At a time when 1 out of 4 Americans cannot afford the outrageously high prices that the pharmaceutical industry charges, we have got to end the absurdity of the American people paying by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We have got to cut the cost of medicine in this country in half, making it comparable with what the rest of the world is paying. Mr. President, the federal minimum wage today is $7.25 an hour. That is a starvation wage. Well, 60% of our people, 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. We must raise that minimum wage to a living wage, at least $17 an hour. If you work 40 hours a week in the richest country on earth, you should not be living in poverty. Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos want to make it harder for workers to join unions. Well, we have got to do exactly the opposite, make it easier for workers to join unions by passing the PRO Act. At a time when we need the best educated workforce in the world, we need to have the best public schools in the world. And among other things, that means we need to substantially raise teachers' salary. We need to attract the best and the brightest young people into education, and we do that, among other things, by making sure that no teacher in America earns less than $60,000 a year. We also radically reform our broken child care system so the little kids in this country get the quality care they need and the workers there are adequately compensated. Mr. President, all over this country, from Vermont to LA, we have a major housing crisis. And it's not just the 800,000 Americans who are homeless. It's millions of working families who are spending 40, 50, or 60% of their limited incomes on housing. Instead of spending almost $1 trillion a year on a wasteful and bloated Pentagon budget, we have got to build millions of units of low-income and affordable housing. And when we do that, we put large numbers of American workers to work at good-paying union jobs. Mr. President, I have heard time and again from Mr. Trump's supporters that the President won the election and he has been given this huge mandate, just an overwhelming mandate to do whatever he wants. Well, no president has the right to move us to oligarchy, authoritarianism, or kleptocracy. But more important, let us not forget that while Trump did win this election, he actually received 4 million votes fewer votes than Biden did in 2020 when Biden won the election. So here we are. Where do we go? What do we do? I think now is the time for the American people to come together, to not allow those who want to divide us up by the color of our skin or our sexual orientation or where we were born. That's what they want to do. They want to divide us up. Now is the time for us to come together like never before and make certain we do not move toward oligarchy, make certain we do not move toward authoritarianism or a kleptocracy. And most importantly, in the richest country in the history of the world, we must understand that we have the capability of providing a decent life for all of our people. We can do that when we stand together and we don't let folks divide us up. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
There's no doubt that Ms. Bondi is highly qualified. In committee, several of my Democrat colleagues even acknowledged as much. She's qualified for the job. She represents mainstream views shared by at least the 77 million Americans who voted for change on November 5th. This should earn her the same bipartisan support this body gave Attorney General Garland, so that's the third time I've said that. My colleagues will not cross the, if my colleagues will not cross the aisle to vote for this qualified nominee, they'll show that Senate Democrats are intent on opposing President Trump's cabinet picks for purely partisan reasons, even at the same time they admit how fully qualified she is to do the job. So ending now, I say once again, I proudly support Ms. Bondi, look forward to confirming her. She's ready and able to serve our country well, and I know she'll work with President Trump to restore faith in the Justice Department. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in confirming Ms. Bondi. I yield.
Now I recognize the senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I'm happy to be on the floor this afternoon with my colleague from New England, Senator Welch from Vermont. We are neighboring states that have been spooning for a very long time. But we're here today to talk about a very serious issue, and that is the tariffs that President Trump is talking about imposing on Canada, goods from Canada and Mexico, and the impact that will have on Americans. On Saturday, President Trump announced a 25% tariff, which would be a tax on imported goods from Canada and Mexico, and a 10% tariff, which would amount to a tax on imported energy from Canada and on all goods from China. So 10% on all goods from China and a 10% on energy from Canada. He's also threatened universal tariffs on all countries. Now, thankfully, the tariffs that he announced on Canada and Mexico appear to have been delayed for a month, but the tariff taxes on China are now in effect. And even though many of these tariff taxes were delayed, they're still scheduled to go into effect next month, and they've created unnecessary panic and uncertainty among businesses and families across the country and in New Hampshire. Now, I want to point out in the beginning very clearly that it's not foreign countries who pay these taxes, these tariff taxes. It's Americans who pay these tariff taxes. These are tariff taxes on imported goods, meaning that the person or company who's importing the good will be footing the bill, and these costs will be passed on to American consumers and businesses. And you don't have to take my word for it. Best Buy's CEO said, and I quote, "The vast majority of that tariff will probably be passed on to the consumer as a price increase." And Walmart's CFO said, "There will probably be cases where prices will go up for consumers." Columbia Sportswear's CEO said about tariffs, "We're set to raise prices, and it's going to be very, very difficult to keep products affordable." Now, if we look at the cost of just the tariff taxes that were originally announced on Saturday, those would raise costs for the average American household by more than $1,200 a year. And if we get into a trade war with increasingly high tariffs on both sides, and that's what it appears could be happening with China, those costs will go up even more. Now, President Trump campaigned on a promise to lower prices for everything. The tariffs that he's talking about would have the exact opposite effect. I'm glad the administration and the president listened to reason. He delayed the start of these tariffs, but I hope we don't have to be back here in a few weeks making this case again. And I want to make sure that people understand what these tariff taxes would do and highlight some of the areas where Americans would be directly affected. First is energy. America imports more oil and gas from Canada than any other product. In New Hampshire, more than half of the gas in people's cars comes from Canada. These tariff taxes would make gas prices go up, and they could even lead to supply shortages because refinery and delivery infrastructure just doesn't turn on a dime. President Trump's new 10% tariff tax on energy from Canada would also directly raise the cost of keeping warm for Granite Staters during the coldest months of this year. In New Hampshire, our #1 import from Canada is heating oil. And nearly 250,000 households in New Hampshire, that's about 40% of our households, more than Vermont, I think, Senator Welch, rely on fuel oil to heat their homes. We're the second highest state in the nation, next to Maine, who relies on #2 heating oil to heat our homes. Another 100,000 Granite Staters rely on propane, and about 30,000 homes use wood. So that's about 60% of New Hampshire that relies on delivered fuel to stay warm. Much of that is coming from Canada. The average home in New Hampshire on heating oil uses about 600 gallons in a winter. And for older, draftier homes, and sadly we have a lot of those in New Hampshire, or those who are further up north, families may be using upwards of 1,000 gallons a winter. And with temperatures dipping as low as 20 below zero in the state in recent weeks, heating oil is a real necessity. And my constituents are already getting notices. I don't know, Senator Welch, if the same is true of your constituents, but I bet it is. But they're saying that those notices tell them their costs are going to go up if these tariffs go into effect. On Sunday, I heard from Derek in Sandwich, New Hampshire, who received a letter from his heating supplier, Irving Oil, that informed him that his bill for heating oil would be going up. The letter stated, "As you may be aware, the U.S. government has announced a new tariff on imports from Canada, including the heating oil or propane that Irving Energy delivers to you." And the letter went on to describe that the tariff costs will be added to the price that he pays, even though he already has a contract. As Derek wrote to me, "I will now have less to spend locally. My local businesses will suffer through lost business and increased costs, and then their suppliers and employees will suffer. It's a real hardship." On Inauguration Day this year, heating oil cost an average of $3.93 a gallon in New Hampshire. Tacking an ill-advised 10% tariff tax on heating oil from Canada could mean about $150 to $250 more for many in New Hampshire just to keep warm through the winter. And while for Elon Musk and his billionaire friends and the billionaire friends of the president, $150 to $250 may not sound like a lot in a winter, but there are a lot of people in New Hampshire for whom $150 to $250 is the difference between staying warm and being cold in the winter. So let me also be clear. We don't use gas and heating oil from Canada because we don't produce it here in the United States. We do it because it makes logistical and economic sense, because in New England, we are at the end of the pipelines that are coming from Texas and the South. Now, the United States produces more oil than any other country in the history of the world. That was true during the last 3 years of the first Trump administration. It was true for the last 4 years of the Biden administration. But for New Hampshire, the St. John refinery in Canada simply provides us the closest, lowest cost supply. And by the way, that refinery sources as much as half of its crude oil from the United States. So it's helping oil producers in the United States send their oil to the refinery, and we get it back in New Hampshire and New England. President Trump campaigned on cutting energy prices in half. Reckless tariffs on Canada and Mexico would make those prices higher, not lower. New Hampshire families shouldn't be punished for what the Wall Street Journal has just called the dumbest trade war in history. And that's not all. These tariff taxes will affect groceries because the U.S. imports 38% of our fresh vegetables, 60% of our fresh fruit, and more than 99% of the coffee that we drink. If we take all these together, Americans could be seeing an extra $200 a year on their grocery bills because of the Trump tariff tax. That doesn't include the longer-term impact of taxes on farm equipment or fertilizer. America imports about 85% of the potash fertilizer we use, and much of that comes from Canada. Now, we already have record high prices for coffee and eggs, if you can find eggs. Some grocery stores are sold out. And one of the things that just happened in the last week is that because of the stop work order that President Trump put on our services that we provide overseas to track bird flu, we're no longer tracking the bird flu that has helped drive up the cost of eggs. So it could get worse, and we're not even going to know about it until we see those prices reflected at the grocery store. Now, any new 25% tariff tax on these imports would make our food more expensive at a time when families are already stretching and straining their household budgets. Tariffs sometimes get talked about as a way to support American manufacturers, but that also misses the mark. Half of the products the U.S. imports are either raw materials or intermediate components, and that means the parts we make into cars or electronics. All of these inputs would get more expensive for American manufacturers, which is only going to make it harder for them to compete internationally. One of the messages I hear regularly from businesses is that uncertainty is one of the hardest things for them to deal with. One example of this is a call I got 2 weeks ago from a small business owner in New Hampshire who sells specialized agricultural equipment, both in the U.S. and overseas. This is a family business with 5 employees. His father founded it 50 years ago, and he reached out specifically because he's worried about what tariffs on the components he buys from Canada could do to his business. For the specialized equipment that he needs, there aren't a lot of manufacturers out there. So he reached out to my office, asking if he was going to have to pay $5,000 more in costs for each of the machines he sells. He took over this business just a couple of years ago, and he's been working to invest to modernize it and expand. Now he has to worry about whether he can try to grow the business, whether he might face new foreign competition, or even if he can pay out bonuses or give raises to his employees. He can't even be certain what kind of pricing schedule he should send out for the year, because his costs could go up $5,000 next month. And last week I heard from another small business, Granite State Packing. It's a startup meat processing company that's only 2 years old. They started just 2 years ago, and they already have 10 employees. Last year, they actually got $1.6 million in a grant from USDA to expand their operations. That's going to allow them to double their workforce. In order to expand, they placed an order for $500,000 in new equipment because the specialized equipment that they use isn't made in the United States. Now, depending on how and when these tariffs go into effect and when their equipment might get delivered, they could be looking at an increased bill for $125,000. That's going to affect whether they can follow through on the expansion, whether they can actually add the staff they want to add, and they don't have any way of knowing if they're going to face an unexpected $125,000 bill because President Trump and this administration hasn't made up their mind what they're going to do about these tariffs. Over the weekend, I had another business owner from C&J Bus Lines. They run a great bus line from the seacoast of New Hampshire to Boston. The owner told me that they've ordered 7 buses from Quebec, new buses, because they're made in Quebec. These tariffs would add $150,000 to the cost of each bus. Now, between that and the higher fuel costs that they would pay, they could be looking at $1.3 million more in added costs this year because of the Trump tariff tax. No small business can easily just absorb a 25% price increase, nor can they plan on how to grow their business and keep providing good-paying jobs with this kind of uncertainty. So, make no mistake, I'm glad the administration delayed these tariffs. I hope they understand how this action would affect America's small businesses and the impact this would have on the economy. And let me finally just talk about housing impacts, because New Hampshire has an affordable housing crisis. These tariffs would make that worse. Lumber makes up about 15% of the cost of building a house, and a lot of building materials, in addition to lumber, are imported. The National Association of Home Builders wrote, in part, and I quote, "Imposing additional tariffs on these imports will ultimately be passed on to home buyers in the form of increased housing prices." That means that this 25% tariff tax would directly add to the cost of building a home at a time when too many Granite Staters and too many Americans across the country already can't afford housing. And we shouldn't pretend that American tariffs are going to go unanswered. Other countries are going to retaliate, and getting into a tit-for-tat trade war is not going to help working Americans pay their bills. Families across New Hampshire and America are worried about the high cost of housing, about the cost of groceries, about what it costs to heat their homes. Business owners are similarly worried about costs or unexpected expenses. I'm hearing regularly from them about the impact of the uncertainty on their ability to grow their businesses because of these tariffs. President Trump promised during his campaign, I'm quoting here, to lower the price of everything. But instead of doing something to lower costs, what he's doing now, what his administration is doing, is planning to add a 25% tariff tax to countless imports from Canada and Mexico. And they've already added a 10% tariff tax on goods coming in from China. And again, while this was delayed at the last minute, this would raise costs for everything from groceries to housing to energy. It would disproportionately hit lower-income families. I'm glad for the delay. I don't want people to misunderstand that. But how is a business or a family supposed to plan when they don't know if important costs like gas or heating or groceries are going to spike any day? I want to finish by reading a quote here. Quote says, "Tariffs are inflationary and would strengthen the dollar, hardly a good starting point for a U.S. industrial renaissance." That's a quote from Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, who just got confirmed when he wrote to his investors just a year ago. I happen to agree with what he said then, but unfortunately the administration he just joined seems to be willing to risk more inflation. These sweeping tariff tax increases would hurt American families, businesses, and workers. I'm glad the taxes on goods from Canada and Mexico were delayed. I hope this administration can provide everyone with certainty that they won't go into effect next month. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield to my colleague from Vermont.
I now recognize the senator from Vermont.
Everything my colleague, the senior senator from New Hampshire, said about New Hampshire and how people are really struggling to pay their bills, the cost of rent, the cost of housing, home heating, fuel in the winter, it's been brutal, groceries, that is totally the same situation for families in Vermont, and it is around the country. And I can't add, really, to the recitation of the practical consequences that this has on businesses and on Vermont families, beyond what Senator Shaheen said. But it really, it mystifies Vermonters. People come up to me and they say, "Peter, seriously? This is going to increase our grocery prices. This is going to mean lumber is more expensive. This is going to mean home heating fuel, and we rely on Canadian gas probably more than you do, but also home heating fuel. This is going to raise our prices. In that $150 to $200 you're talking about, that's real, that's real money. And they just are mystified that we would, through the president, increase their monthly bills. And for what reason? I want to talk a little bit about that. New Hampshire and Vermont, we mostly get along, but we're rivals in hockey and other things. But we both have incredibly close relationships with Canada. They're our friends. In Vermont, we have a library in Derby, Vermont, that's half in Vermont and half in New Hampshire. And our kids are going back and forth to play hockey. And that's just on a very personal level, the affection that we have for Canada and they have for us. They come down and ski in our mountains. They come down and visit. We go up there. And there's an element of, Peter, what's going on? National security is the reason you're doing this? Is there a threat from Canada to our national security? We know there isn't. So this is an arbitrary decision that is made by the president, in my view, abusing authority that Congress gave him to use tariffs if there is, in fact, a national security threat, which all of us in a common sense way would think it might be something from a military threat or it might be from the coercive economic policies that we face from China. There's a legitimate case there for national security, but Canada has been in the trenches with us in every war that we've had. They have been by our side. They're our friends. And, that's another thing people ask. Peter, you don't treat your friends this way. You just don't do that. So I had a concern, come here, I'm trying to find my glasses, about what the impact was on Vermont. And instead of me speculating about it, I'm looking for just 1 minute, here it is. Instead of me speculating about it, Mr. President, what we did is invited some Vermonters who have businesses, some Vermont families, come and tell us what's going to happen if we have these tariffs. And let me tell you some of what they said. We met in St. Albans, which is a few miles from the Canadian border. And I asked these businesses, just tell us what happens. First of all, there was nobody in these businesses who said that the cost of this tariff would not be passed on to the consumer, all right? Common sense. It's like somehow if there's a 25% increase in cost, the business can just eat it, when we know, especially our small businesses, they're operating on the margin. They're doing every single thing they can to make their product competitive and affordable for the people they're serving. These are really, really good people who are totally committed to the communities that they're in. Every one of them said, whatever the cost of the tariff is, that is going to be passed on to the consumer. Not that they like to do that, but they have to pay their own bills. It's just reality. The second thing they talked about was the uncertainty that occurs for businesses. One business was talking about how when these tariffs goes in, and by the way, we have some history with this in the last Trump administration, there was supposedly a tariff, but if you knew the back entrance into the White House and could make a connection with somebody who had influence, you could get an exemption. So you get this terrible situation, which is not going to be available, by the way, for our Vermont fuel dealers or our Vermont home builders. If you know somebody, you somehow got out of the tariff, and there's no guidance about how these tariffs would have been rolled out. So there was an enormous opportunity for special treatment to be given. But even then, the complexity of this, like for instance, one manufacturer was talking about if you got a certain kind of aluminum, it was subject to the tariff. But if you got an ever so slightly different definition of aluminum, that you wouldn't be subject to the tariff. So you have a whole production process that has been using aluminum A that would be subject to a tariff. And if you go to aluminum B, if you can find it, it won't be subject to a tariff. If you got a square panel, it would be subject. If it was rectangular, you wouldn't. I mean, this is truly bizarre because there's no common sense in this at all. So I keep asking the question, why? Why are we doing this? Why are we inflicting this complexity on our businesses? Why are we inflicting this cost on our consumers and on our business? And there's no justification for it at all. So let me go through some of the stories, Mr. President. Garrick Herchak at Manufacturing Solutions. They do precision machining. You know, they're a manufacturer. That's what we want. And there's no margins on it. They work with sheet metal and cardboard. And he said these tariffs create a whole burden to determine what is tariffed, the type or shape of aluminum, and he is bracing to respond to whatever chaos comes next. And this company has been in business for 29 years, and it employs 275 people. That is a big deal in our state of Vermont. Big deal. Why mess with him? Why? Rock Gollin at Water Innovations. They make, we have better maple syrup than New Hampshire, I'm sorry to say, and definitely better than Canada. They make the equipment that's used in maple syrup production. And this is going to increase their cost and threaten jobs. And it really does threaten jobs, okay? And then if you lose a market, by the way, then it's hard to get it back. So this company, where it might face this huge increase in cost of aluminum to manufacture its products, could lose market share and not be able to claw their way back. Mike Tatro from Poulin Grain. Poulin Grain is a great Franklin County family-run, actually Northeast Kingdom too, family-run grain dealer. They've been around for generations. And they've paid a huge contribution in keeping our dairy farms going. They import organic grain, huge market in Vermont. Their products are heavy to transport. Think of corn and canola and oats. So they need to buy nearby, and they buy from Canada. And important, it's 30 to 40% of what they buy, and these tariffs could cost them about $10 million. And it's just like the fuel dealers. You know, they've got a contract, but they honor their customers. They can't eat $10 million. It just can't be done. So the Poulin family is really worried about the cost rising for farmers who are on a thinnest of thin margins, and nobody works harder than our dairy farmers. That is hard work, but it's so important to us in the state of Vermont that we give them every chance to succeed when they're facing tough odds every day. And why in the world would an act of the President of the United States add to the burden these dairy farmers already face when they're trying to hang on? It's just, it doesn't make any sense to me. He also said something that Mike said, something that's really important. You know, the unknown and uncertainty, it's very difficult. There seems to be a point of view in the Trump administration, president, I'll be candid, that he thinks chaos is a good negotiating tool. I'll leave it to others to decide their view on that. But if the chaos creates this uncertainty for the Poulin Grain Company, for the dairy farmers in Franklin County, for a family that is hoping they can build a house and they thought they had a price, for a family that's struggling to pay their groceries at the end of the month, that uncertainty is really an infliction of distress that's unfair and unreasonable. And to create uncertainty in everyday people who are trying to live in their community, do a good job for the people that they serve, families that are trying to do their contribution in the community and keep the well-being of their family together, and they're on a tight margin, it's cruel to inflict unnecessarily uncertainty. You know, the people from Vermont, the people from New Hampshire, and I think this is true around the country, They're okay with facing hard and grim circumstances. And they'll grit their way through it. And they'll take care of their kids. And they'll take care of their community. They'll be generous. But you know what? When a hardship that is something they have to deal